This is the Fifth Estate winning headlines, your media police post. Brought to you by the Fort Hall School of Government, coming to you from Nairobi, Kenya. In this segment, we summarize some of the headlines that you might have missed this morning. But we also take a look at the political pieces that we call cartoons in this country. Today is the 17th of April 2020 and I am 2J.
I am DM.
And I am GK, and in case you missed the headlines, here they are. In the Daily Nation, cash for needy health workers in tight budget. In the Standard, when the reggae stopped. And in the Star, COVID-19, hiring of 3,000 cops stopped, and other stories. So where do you want that again from the Star? Shall we begin with the Standard, when the reggae stopped?
Essentially, the Standard is telling us that the coronavirus is a political game changer because it has brought the BBI chorus to a slowdown and complicated the political terrain for Uhuru Kenyatta and Raila Odinga. And they're specifically citing the inability to congregate people, which was, of course, the BBI's bloodline. But I disagree. I disagree. I think reggae has not stopped.
It continues.
It continues. 2J was saying that it usually begins from 7:01 sharp after
curfew.
And actually that the corona is good for BBI. I mean, one of the most valuable things in politics is time. And this is giving all political schemers time to congregate, time to think about how to use legislative instruments to their advantage. So reggae is continuing.
Exactly.
I like the part of the article that says that Uhuru and Raila have to play this very carefully, because if you come out too close after corona with BBI things, are you being insensitive when an economy is, in recovery? People are just trying to get over this initial shock of this pandemic.
Public perception maybe.
So it will be interesting, but for people to think politics has stopped, I think it's
impossible.
Foolish.
I feel like even just looking at the US as an example, it's proof that politics and reggae can never stop. The US this year alone has to have both a census and an election by the end of the year. So I think just looking globally, politics can't stop because of a pandemic. It's
and
not
you
possible.
saw voting in some primaries, and they did the social distancing thing and are continuing in the run up to the election. Okay, so we have a 3-part criteria that we use to break down the headlines. We ask ourselves, is it topical or speculative? Is it repetitive or groundbreaking? And is it thoughtful or just plain lazy? It's not repetitive on this one occasion. I quite like it. We can park it.
Yes, park it.
So in the Daily Nation, cash for needy health workers in tight budget. And this is coming off the president's address last night or yesterday evening, where he basically outlined a number of things. Now, I don't know about you guys, but this speech was dreary. It
fell flat.
You know what, guys? It was a good speech, just delivered badly. I think
precisely.
I think the problem lies with the president's speech writers. I think they are a committee of engineers and economists and scientists. Speech writing is an art.
It is.
Communication, it is.
So he told fellow Kenyans that he has set aside around 2 billion shillings for the Ministry of Health coronavirus response. And then he has also set aside monies for the elderly, for the disabled, to the tune of about 8.5 billion. But also that the COVID weekly stipend has begun. I think this week they trialed a number of households using the Nyumba Kumi structure. And so at least there'll be some of these low-income households being helped.
Now you see, GK, everything you've just said is so brilliant. And had the speech been delivered with a bit of oomph, that information might have actually reached the ears of our fellow Kenyans. But unfortunately, Uhuru pulled a Ruto, right? He gave us a speech with information that was not delivered aptly, or there was almost a repetition, of
so they're not equal. They're equal. They're 1-1.
He also told fellow Kenyans that they will be reducing the development budget, which will affect his big four in effect, and increase the recurrent budget for his government by 24.3 billion. So you can see that a lot of sacrifices are being made in terms of development just to fight this pandemic.
And And that's what the STAR speaks to as well.
Yes.
COVID-19, hiring of 3,000 cops stop.
Yes.
So they talk about how there's a bunch of projects that the government had set out for the year that now have been put on pause. Defense, foreign affairs, presidency, Big Four agenda have all been affected.
Yeah.
But what they are speaking to here is the hiring of 3,000 cops. And they say that for the third year in a row, the government has had to pause the hiring of new administration police and GSU officers. And they say specifically this year, there was supposed to be 2,000 APs and 1,000 GSU officers that they've had to put a pause on.
Yeah.
And other money that's had to be redirected away from other programs into COVID-19 assistance.
Yes.
I wish
So-
the Star had delved deeper into what those things mean.
Yeah.
What a reduction in those budget lines actually
Mean on the
means going forward.
Yeah.
Anyway, so
true.
people should re-listen to the president's speech with an open heart.
They should maybe re-listen.
It had important
Yes.
points.
And then he also applauded Kenyans. He said, you know what, we're all operating in tight conditions, but
Yeah.
he said, you know what, good job, and keep adhering to the rules for those of you who are. And yeah, so it's interesting times.
Yeah.
So who do we give our winning headline?
Reggae.
Yeah, the Standard I think wins hands down.
Yeah,
Okay, there you have it. The Standard gives us our winning headline. Onto the political pieces that we call cartoons in this country, where we also have a three-part criteria that we use. We ask ourselves, is it humorous or dry? Is it satirical or pessimistic? And is it effective or just plain lazy?
On the Daily Nation, we see a running track, and it's a relay. It's a relay
Race,
and Sonko is supposed to hand over the baton to General Badi, the new head of the Nairobi Metropolitan, but he's reluctant to do that. In fact, he's not going to. And on the sidelines watching are Eugene Wamalwa and the president, and they're shocked.
They have their hands on their heads.
On their heads.
And rightly so. Sonko is reclaiming his county. It was taken under duress.
Gosh.
And now he's realizing maybe the error of his ways in signing over some of these functions. And without money, those functions mean nothing, which is what he's doing.
So he's not signing now because it has money attached to.
Yes. So there's a bill that was allocating about 15 billion shillings to Nairobi Metropolitan Services to do some of those functions that it was transferred. But he's saying, nope.
I would like to officially demand a list from IBC of all the individuals who voted for Sonko. I want to know who they are, because he's become an international embarrassment to the point where people across, the ponds and the oceans are hearing about this Nairobi governor who's offering Hennessy bottles to his constituents in order to help them fight corona.
And mind you, the WHO has come and said that people who are drinking alcohol are making themselves more vulnerable to coronavirus. So interesting.
But actually, if you go on Twitter, you'll find that there's a lot of international Sonko supporters who are saying, leave that poor governor alone.
Yeah,
he knows what he's doing by giving people Hennessy.
This is what happens when you vote 6p, people. That is what happens. So in the Standard, we have the Great China Wall, I presume, and you can see a Chinese dragon. The Chinese dragon is really, breathing heavy smoke there and fire. And you can see poor Africans running away with suitcases on their heads, and, they're very shocked. And this is, there's been a lot of xenophobic attacks towards Africans in China. And people have been evicted from their homes and such.
Refuse services, exactly. Out of the fear of the Chinese, who they believe themselves are the carriers of the disease.
But here China showing its true colors, essentially.
Yeah, I think it's a good cartoon. Yeah. My favorite part, if anything, is the coloring of the red flag. I think
It makes it very stark.
Yeah.
In the Star, Ozone has drawn a funeral procession. There's pallbearers,
professional ones,
yes, carrying a coffin with the Jubilee sign on it, I think indicating the death of Jubilee. And then the pallbearers have the face of Tuju and Murathe, and they're dancing. They look very merry. And then on top of the coffin is Moses Kuria and William Ruto. And I think what Ozone is implying here is that they're in denial. They're riding on the coffin to resist burial of the party. And the caption there is "Till death do us part," and the death has arrived.
Oh, this is hilarious! So good.
We did announce the death of Jubilee, the Jubilee party here earlier this week. So this is not news.
So this is relating to the tradition of, is it West African funerals?
Yeah. And Ghanaians especially, who sort of have these really
Elaborate.
Elaborate.
This is a new capitalistic tradition. They're just
The videos are
extracting
fantastic.
money from mourners. They're very entertaining.
How they dance,
So who do we give our winning cartoon?
The Star 100%, I think.
Just for being humorous?
Yes, yeah.
The Star gives us our winning cartoon. What is our final thought?
And now our final thought. Today, this Friday, we bring you a little bit of insight into the African Renaissance. But I think before we get into that, GK, would you like to summarize this week?
I will. So this week we explored the Renaissance, the rebirth of certain eras. We looked at the positive things that can come out of societal crisis. So on Monday, we looked at the European Renaissance of the 14th to the 17th century. And we saw that it was a cultural movement that promoted classical philosophy, literature, and art that was based on a humanist philosophy that emphasized the value and agency of human beings individually and collectively. And we saw that this era had famous intellectuals such as Thomas Hobbes, Da Vinci, Machiavelli, Galileo, among others. On Tuesday, we looked at the Harlem Renaissance, an iconic time in American history. And this started from the 1920s, and it was a cultural revolution of arts, again, music and culture. Also known as the New Negro movement, where we saw blues and jazz, formerly known as jazz, become prominent, and we saw African American authors writing about the Black American experience. We saw Langston Hughes, Alain Locke, among others. The Harlem Renaissance came to represent the ideas of the new Negro, who used art and literature to uplift his race. On Wednesday, we looked at the Roaring Twenties, a decade of social changes, but also economic prosperity in Europe and America. And we saw the rise of mass entertainment and growth of consumer goods. And it was an era where the nation's total wealth more than doubled. And we also saw how the woman's role changes and was redefined after the men had gone to war and she had to step up. On Thursday, we looked at the Arab Renaissance, also known as Al-Naqda, where we saw a cultural and political movement in the late 19th and 20th century. And we saw it as a period of intellectual modernization and reforms. We also saw the spread of press and publications. And today we're looking at Africa's Renaissance.
Yes, grounded.
Yes.
So the African Renaissance concerns itself with the rebirth of the African continent. I think it might be fair to say that this hasn't exactly happened yet, but many have written about its potential, including icons of black politics such as Kwame Nkrumah, W.E.B. Du Bois, Sheikh Anta Diop, Charles Nyerere, and Kenneth Kaunda. But of all these people who've explored it, no one has really agreed on what this African Renaissance should look like or what should actually motivate its start, should like kick it into gear. But I think the unfortunate reality is that the independence struggle delivered freedom and self-rule for Africans, but in some ways it failed to deliver an enlightened, wealthier, stronger, and independent continent. So I think one of the first to address this idea of the African Renaissance was Cheikh Anta Diop. He was a Senegalese anthropologist, philosopher, and he studied pre-colonial African history. And he discussed this openly in his 1948 book when he asked, when can we speak of the African Renaissance? In an anthology of essays called Towards the African Renaissance, Essays in Culture and Development. So he wrote this when he was a student in Paris. And the funny thing is, his thesis had actually been rejected several times by his lecturers because I think it concerned things that the West was not ready yet to explore. So for him, he says that while we can talk about African Renaissance in relation to music, sculpture, and language, for him, language is one of the key things that we need to achieve as a grand objective. So he says in order to develop African languages, he charges African writers to write for Africans in African languages. But another person who also looked at it was Kwame Nkrumah, and he is Ghanaian. And he said that the African Renaissance must focus on history. And he compares the European Renaissance to the African one, and says that for the Europeans, they found philosophical expression as a way to liberate them from the shackles of religion. But it was all balanced by capitalism. And he says that for Africans, our balance will come when we put African philosophy back into the context where it came from. And he says that for us, we must look at our history in isolation from European adventures. It shouldn't be about colonialism as starting African history. We should look at what happened before. And then finally, we look at 1998, where President of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, revisited this idea again. And he talked about the new dawn of African Renaissance. And he said that the end of apartheid in South Africa would usher in political, social, economic, and cultural renewal of the African continent. And he said that this Renaissance would rest on 4 pillars, on political, economic, social, and cultural things. But I think my question still remains, what actually causes a Renaissance to happen? Because we spoke about this on Monday. Renaissance comes from the French naissance, which would suggest that there would have to be death in order for rebirth to happen. So are we saying that when we became independent, that was our rebirth? Did we then miss that moment for Renaissance because of plundering, because of, you know, how the Europeans treated us? And I don't know what the answer to that question is, and maybe, you know, other people would help with that.
One of the answers is the cooptation of the African elite. I mean, there was a creation of a predatory elite that could otherwise have taken us through this period of renaissance, but chose not to. You mentioned Thabo Mbeki. Yes, he did try to put to the fore the thoughts of the African Renaissance. He articulated them very well in speeches. And no sooner had that started taking root in Africa than cold water was poured on it. The Economist, the very famous, haughty British publication, in May of 2000, did a cover story titled The Hopeless Continent. And it just gave bad history and skewed anthropology and very vulgar political science perspective. But this only goes to show how powerful that thought of the African Renaissance was, that it had to be systematically dismantled. Anyway, now that we are talking about the African Renaissance, we would be remiss if we didn't deliver a sermon.
Shall I cue the organs?
Cue the organs. And I'll begin the sermon with a testimony. I first heard about Sheikh Anta Diop's work when I was already an adult in my 20s. And it was thanks to a truant professor who took a whole semester to take us through his seminal works. That's Professor V.G. Simiu. Thank you, sir. And that really changed my perspective, and I'm sure also of other classmates who had gone through a similar education system that I had. And this just brings to question, or it got me to question our African Kenyan education system, and if the works of African philosophers and African intellectuals is sufficiently incorporated. I don't think so. But I could be wrong, and this is where I'll do the altar call in our YouTube comments. Tell us what your experience is if you have an African education or a Kenyan education, because maybe some of you were exposed to the works of our very own Kenyan Ali Mazrui, and you know about his arguments about the African Renaissance, including indigenization and regionalization within Africa, and also with Africa and the diaspora, or about Sheikh Anta Diop himself. But I'd also like to point out one of my favorite thoughts from him, and it's about language, as Tuje had said. And this is my favorite quote. Africans are forced to make a double effort. To assimilate the meaning of words, and then through a second intellectual effort to capture the reality that is expressed by the words. And this makes me think Chinese children are learning math and science in Chinese, so they don't have to make the double intellectual effort of integrating the language and then learning the concept. And it's no wonder that in many areas they're the leaders of innovation. The other example I always like to give is Kenyan athletes. We have the best athletes in the world, and I always say I think by this time the world should know how Kalenjin sounds like, because after running a 42-kilometer race, the athlete has to go and grapple with a language that is not hers or his, and talk about their running experience and the tactics that they use. Meanwhile, Spanish footballers get interpreters and subtitles. It is very skewed. So I'll end with scripture. Whoever controls your language of discourse controls your reality. Which book is that from, Tuje?
That is from the book of Prof.
Interesting. So, I mean, it was interesting, I think, looking at the African Renaissance, and we're still trying to grapple with whether it's happening, whether it happened, how it should have happened. But there are some who argue that no Renaissance in Africa can happen without African unity. And so without that basis, you can have the successes of decolonization in the 60s, and then the successes of democratization in the 1990s, but still no real renaissance. There's no that common thread that happens. And many intellectuals have claimed to know what is needed in order to trigger or to have this Africa Renaissance. I'll speak a bit about Ali Mazrui, our Kenyan intellectual, who argued that in order for this Renaissance to happen, you need 3 major revolutions in skills, in values, and in gender relations. And then he takes it a step further. He says it won't just happen like that. We need to go and have different areas leading different parts of the Renaissance.
Yes.
So he argues in South Africa, they will lead the Pan-Africanism of economic integration. Eastern Africa will lead the lingo-cultural integration, and this is because of the existence of Swahili.
Yes.
Northern Africa would lead that of the political integration. That's because of the region's shared political, religion, language, and culture. And history as well. And then Western Africa would lead that of the military integration, and that's because of the precedent set by ECOWAS. But then he also then says, okay, political reform is needed, but so is economic development, and they both need to happen in order for this Renaissance to move forward. He also questions whether we misused our crisis, so that, like you said, post-colonization, should we have used this as a moment to really trigger the rebirth of Africa? Because he says that we never really dealt with the cultural, economic, and social deformity that the colonialists left Africa. And so without dealing with that, we can never really have this Renaissance. So interestingly, there's this thing that they've been saying about, or rather other intellectuals have said that in order to remedy or have the Renaissance, we need to deal with the economy first. So you have proponents of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, in which all of Africa will start to leverage its unity as it deals with the global economy. Because since slavery, we have been dealing in the global economy, yet we have not received sort of the benefits that we really should. But even then with that, you still have like the status of the free trade area, where 28 out of 54 countries have signed on, which means there's a huge population that has still not signed on to this agreement. So there's a lot of conversation there about what should come first. Is it the political, the philosophy, those ideas, or is it we deal with the economy first? And
or should they be concurrent?
Or together? Lots of food for thought there with the African Renaissance. So we had a challenge yesterday where I asked you, when I take 5 and add 6, I get 11. But when I take 6 and 7, I get 1. What am I? A lot of you got it right. The answer was, I am a clock.
TJ, your answer was 250.
And today
we're still grappling with the question.
You still don't get it. So in today's quarantine challenge, I am the first on earth, the second in heaven. I appear twice in a week, though you can only see me once in a year. What am I? So please leave your answers in our YouTube section. And I want to leave you with this. Ali Mazrui once said, "You are not a country, Africa. You are not a concept, Africa. You are a glimpse of the infinite. So let's always be the choice architects of our future." So we had a winning headline from The Standard and a winning cartoon from The Star. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Find us on TV. We're on GoTV, Pan Free to Air, and Star Times. Have a lovely weekend.